Welcome to the I Believe podcast, an A Cure Insight production, brought to you by Castle Biosciences. I'm your host, Danae Peterson, a fellow ocular melanoma survivor. Here on the podcast, we'll be sharing information and insights on treatments, research, and living with ocular melanoma.
Castle Biosciences tests are designed to provide clinicians precise and personalized tumor information for the benefit of patient care. If you would like more information about how Castle is transforming the treatment of eye cancer, visit castletestinfo.com.
With me today, I have Dr. Maureen Sanger, and am I saying that correctly? Okay. So Dr. Maureen Sanger, and she's from Nashville, Tennessee. You guys might have seen her in the I Believe series that we had in Nashville last year in October for the I Believe seminar. She was there during the metastatic discussions. And the stuff that we talked about in those discussions, it was obviously important enough to our community, to me, to want to bring her back. And so I just asked if she would come back and talk to us a little more about just from her perspective as a psychologist in navigating a cancer diagnosis. So I'm so glad you're here. Before I introduce you fully, I want to just run through a couple of quick announcements. We do have posted on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. You should be able to go to any of those channels and you can find the links to all of the current walks. So we have the Looking for a Cure, which is our 5K walk for ocular melanoma. And this is going to be taking place all across the country. I think we have about 14 locations starting in May and going till the end of the year. So if you're not in an area where there's a walk, hopefully there's only one, maybe a state away. And if you want to plan to travel, then we hope you'll join us. But most important thing is to sign up, make your team, get your friends and family in your community on board, and then start fundraising for ocular melanoma in your community. So we are so glad and so grateful to have Gavin and Hannah helping us to orchestrate all of these walks, and we hope you guys will sign up. If you have any questions, just email us. You can find us at contact@acureinsight.org. Okay, so that's all I've got for announcements right now. So just by way of introduction, Dr. Sanger has a PhD in psychology, and she works for Tennessee Oncology, providing counseling to cancer patients and survivors. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Vanderbilt University, and she trained at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Prior to joining Tennessee Oncology, she was an Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Vanderbilt, where she was able to work with the cancer and sickle cell disease programs. So, Dr. Sanger, thank you again for being here and for your patience.
Mutual. Thank you.
All right. So, we wanted to talk today about just the idea of protecting our mental health as patients. And I think really it's important to note that, really anything that we talk about, applicable to patients can mostly be translated, like the tools that we can use as a patient could also be translated to caregivers, to children of patients. And so it's important, I think, for us to recognize that we're going to talk a little more specifically to patients, but if you're not a patient, this doesn't stop applying to you or stop being helpful.
Yes.
Do you think that would be fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Great point.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your background. What drew you to the world of psychology and specifically supporting people in the cancer community?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I've always been drawn to the helping professions, but it was really when I was in graduate school in psychology that I developed a real interest in health psychology. So how the ways that psychology could translate to helping people with acute and chronic illnesses, helping them with medical procedures. And at the time I was in graduate school, which was several years ago now, the field of health psychology was kind of an emerging specialty. And so that's what I kind of focused on. And I had the privilege of doing some training at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And it was really there where I developed a deep interest in and compassion for people going through cancer and their families. And that interest has kind of stayed all these years. I've done some other work in health psychology, but over the last several years have come back to helping people with cancer. And it's been incredibly rewarding and something that I find inspiring as well. I think I learn as much oftentimes from the people I talk to as hopefully they learn from me.
Thank you for just explaining that. And I feel like it's important to just note that people in these kinds of professions, whether they're oncologists, whether they're therapists, like they're drawn to them for a reason. And usually that passion is something that then, I feel like drives excellent care for patients. And it makes it so that the patients, I'm sure, that come to you feel very comfortable in just engaging in a conversation about their mental health, and in supporting, in knowing that they have your support.
Yeah, and I think,
So
and hopefully they benefit from kind of my knowledge and the skills and strategies I share with them. But I also find that many people really benefit from hearing what I'm able to share with them about how other people in their circumstance cope, and just knowing that their reactions or how they're doing is similar to others, that the struggles they have are similar to other people going through it, I think is really valuable.
No, I think that's such a good point. So just to kind of give people a background, because you work at Tennessee Oncology, you work closely with Meredith McKean. And so Meredith McKean is, for those of you who in our community don't know her, she is one of the medical oncologists who focuses on helping patients who have uveal melanoma or metastatic ocular melanoma. So I think it's safe to say you have a few patients that you work with who have the same cancer that we do. So if you were to share, generalized stories about some of those patients, like, it's because you're speaking from experience. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that we articulate that. So let's just kind of talk about general reasons for protecting your mental health. Like, when you're facing a cancer diagnosis, why does it become more important, like from your perspective and in your opinion, like to protect your mental health and to focus on your mental health?
Yeah. Well, because as and those that are listening, I'm sure, cancer affects more than person's physical health and well-being. Right? It often takes the toll on a person's emotions and their mental health, and the stress that comes from a cancer diagnosis or a cancer recurrence or metastasized cancer can be overwhelming, and so anxiety, depression are not unusual among people who are going through this really stressful or traumatic event. And when we're dealing with anxiety or depression or just emotional overwhelm, it can affect our physical well-being in the sense that, right, maybe we don't eat as well as we should, or we don't move our bodies. We don't. It can disrupt our sleep. Sometimes it makes it hard to get to medical appointments, to stick to medical regimens and take medications, and so our mental health can affect our kind of health behaviors, but it also can affect our body image, our sense of just our sense of physical well-being. And so, we often talk about the connection between the body and the mind. Our physical health can affect our mental well-being, and our mental well-being, our knowledge, our emotions, beliefs, attitudes can affect our physical well-being. So mind and body are connected. When we're dealing with a chronic illness, it's going to affect us mentally, emotionally, and so tending to that, as well as to the physical part, means that we're tending to the kind of our whole person, our whole being, and that's what's going to contribute to overall better coping.
Okay, so I feel like that's good to draw that connection, and I want to kind of latch on to one of the things that you talked about, just because I know this is something that's a little more unique to people who go through our diagnosis. And I think that most of the people you probably initially see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the people you probably initially see, they are coming to Dr. McKean primarily for a METS diagnosis. So is that fair to say, or do you feel like you also see some patients who have yet to metastasize?
I see both.
Okay, so let's just talk first about kind of the initial diagnosis phase, because I think one of the big things that kind of gets, I don't want to say downplayed, because it's not that it's not talked about, but it just kind of doesn't take precedence, and I think that it really does affect our mental health as patients, is the idea that our eye is affected. Mm-hmm. And so because of that signature piece of your appearance, something changes, whether it's because you lose the eye and you end up with an enucleated eye, whether it's because or just that it looks a little bit different, or maybe it only looks different to you, because sometimes I think our perceptions are different than other people's perceptions. But the bottom line is something has happened to your eye, you are aware of it, and on some level, you're probably physically seeing that difference every single day, or not seeing in some cases. So, what are some things that patients can do as they're facing this initial appearance change, combined with vision loss of some degree, varying from little vision loss to complete vision loss? What would be maybe some tools or some resources that you would suggest that they lean into for kind of coping with that kind of with that stress on their mental psyche? Because I feel like it does play a big role.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only is there the physical effects, like say the impact on vision, but it's a more visible cancer oftentimes, and that creates a whole other set of issues. Right, there's the self-consciousness that people often experience, and it's also kind of a very visible and constant reminder that that you have cancer, and that can be really hard. So I think one of the strategies is to not only inform yourself about the disease and what it involves, because at the beginning there's so much to learn. There's so much that seems uncertain. So asking questions, informing yourself about what this involves, and how to navigate this disease is important. But also, I think being able to talk to other people about it, and so that people understand what you're going through, that how your vision is affected and how that might affect different of your activities, and why you may look different. I think being able to share that with people can help their understanding, and also enable them to perhaps provide the kinds of support that might be useful along the way.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think another useful tool, and one of the core principles that I often talk to people about, is this idea of taking control of what you can. So there's a lot about going through cancer and cancer treatment that's out of one's control. And that's one of the hardest parts emotionally and mentally in dealing with cancer, is that so much of this is out of your control. You're kind of thrust into this world of uncertainty, which can make it difficult to plan, can make it and can make a lot of things difficult. And so trying to acknowledge that there's a lot of this that you can't control, but that there are things within this experience that you do have some control over, and trying to focus on those things can be, I think, one of the keys to coping. So, for example, learning about your type of cancer, your cancer treatment, how to take care of yourself from a medical perspective, something you have control over, taking care of your body, nourishing it, getting decent rest, moving your body, and exercising as you can, is something you have control over. Staying connected to friends and to activities that are important to you is something that you have some control over. Sometimes establishing routines, when lots of things are uncertain in our lives, creating routines and sticking to routines can provide some structure and predictability in life, and that can help balance that living with uncertainty. Setting goals. People with cancer, I think the task is to find ways to live well with this really difficult disease. Setting short-term goals, scheduling things to look forward to. Those are some of the things that you have control over, and that are useful to focus on, and can help with coping.
No, I love that, and I like. I feel like we talk about it. We talk about it every single time that we talk about mental health, and it's just that, again, like you said, that idea of we control what we can when everything is out of control, as Olaf from Frozen so eloquently stated it. But I think it's interesting, like, as you're going through some of these examples, I mean, I can recognize them now, like in hindsight, as things that are, things that I would seek to control as a patient.
Mm.
But to hear it like listed out, I feel like that helps on some level, just recognizing that there are, like, it can be really, really easy. And I'm sure you know this, that our brains are wired to go to the negative. And so that's just part of survival. Like, that's just how they work. They're going to be aware of the threats, and they're going to be aware of the potential things that could go wrong. But if we can kind of shift that focus, not that it makes those things go away. It doesn't make the fact that you have a tumor in your eye and you lost your vision, it doesn't make it go away. It doesn't make scanxiety or the scans looming 6 months, a year from now, 3 months from now. It doesn't make them disappear or make the information in them any less scary or daunting. But to then find the things that you can shift your focus to that are controllable, like learning what you can, doing the things you love, taking care of your body in the ways that feel good and authentic to you. And even just like one of the things you mentioned was just planning things to look forward to, like, because I feel like that's such a key thing. Like, a lot of times, we're faced with this cancer diagnosis. We're told, I mean, I know maybe not all of us are told this now. I hope not many of us are told that there's, something terrible is going to happen in the next year after your immediate diagnosis. But I know that 10 years ago, that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
Many patients were told, okay, like, get your affairs in order. Like, you don't have much time. And so thankfully we don't have to deal with that in the same ways. But I think that the level of kind of fear, the residual fear from that is still there. And it still very much feels like that. And so to then kind of shift back the focus from, okay, what is going to be happening in 10 years from now? And to just say, okay, what's going to happen a month from now? What am I going to do 10 years or 10 months from now? What am I going to do a year from now that I'm looking forward to, that has me excited about life, that has me excited about living? Because I feel like one of the things, this has something more to do with the grieving cycle, but I think it still applies. Like, I had a miscarriage in October of 2018. And then I got pregnant again 3 months later with my third baby, who is now 3. And I remember at one point being so terrified in the first trimester of, like, the what if, of what could happen, because I had already had one loss and I knew that it was possible. Like, now it was no longer something detached from me. It was something that had happened to me. It was something that had happened to my family. And I didn't feel like I could handle that loss again. And one of the things that my mom had told me was this idea that, like, we don't need to grieve it twice. You don't need to be so afraid of the what if and the possibility that it could go wrong, and then have it actually go wrong and have grieved it 2 times in a row. So instead of living in a way where, you're afraid that cancer is going to take your life, and then maybe inevitably it does in 10 years. Maybe it does. We don't know. But don't do it twice. Don't let it take your life twice, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a really important perspective. And right, our minds are really great at churning out lots of what ifs, right? And you're right. We're wired to kind of our minds have what we call a negativity bias. We tend to focus on the negative, worry about the negative, right? How often do we find ourselves saying, "Oh, what if this good thing happens, or what if that good thing happens?" That's not what we what if about, right? We what if about the scary things or the negative things. So it's really about kind of making a conscious effort to focus one's attention on away from the what ifs onto other things. And I sometimes I use the expression, you're shifting from the what if to the what is.
I like
what
that.
What is it that's what is it that I'm dealing with right now? What is it that I can do today in the service of my health, in the service of my emotional well-being? What is it that I know today? As of today, I'm alive, and I have things that I can perhaps look forward to and plan. And it takes, but it's not easy to do. It's easy to say, "Oh, shift from what if to what is." In reality, that's a difficult thing to do, and it takes a kind of conscious effort and decision to focus the attention on the present, which is another, I think, really important coping tool, which is trying to live in the present. And again, a lot of people hear that phrase, and And it's
Easier said than done sometimes, for sure.
absolutely. But when we really immerse ourselves in the present, and when we're more mindful or attentive to what is it that we're working on right now, who is it that we're talking to, it really does enrich our lives in ways that can be very useful. And you brought up the example of or talked about planning, right? Having things to look forward to. We said a little bit about that, and I just wanted to emphasize that because many of the people I talk to when they're going through cancer treatment and they're living with such uncertainty is, they have this sense of, well, I don't want to I don't want to jinx myself. Like this idea of somehow if I plan something and maybe that's kind of asking for trouble, or so we can develop these kind of
irrational
fears, kind of magical thinking about that.
No, I can recognize that pattern in myself. But what I can say is that, initially when I was diagnosed, at least for me, it was during COVID. So there was a lot of kind of less that I could plan to do outside of my own sphere, right? I couldn't really plan a vacation. I couldn't take my kids to to somewhere like Disneyland or something like that. I couldn't think of something kind of grandiose, and not that it has to be that. You can have little things to look forward to. It can absolutely just be looking forward to a glass of wine at the end of the day on the scans. like whatever it is, it does not have to be big, but those were kind of the things that my brain would go to and go, okay, but if you plan this, then is that, again, like you said, is that asking for something to go wrong? Is that asking for something? And I was fortunate enough to have an ocular oncologist who, at the time that I was ready to drop the plans of the fun that we had planned as a family and just focus on my treatment. She said, no, you're going to go have fun. We'll take care of this when you get back. We can't get it together faster anyway, because I was going to have brachytherapy. And so it's we have a timeline here. We're gonna do it, but you're gonna still go have fun with your family. And I feel like that was such a gift for me as a patient to have my doctor tell me to focus on that, because then it was then something that became not easier, but it just became a little bit more ingrained in me to practice, because it was something that I had done from the get-go, from diagnosis, was plan something to look forward to. Even if there's hard stuff, even if there's difficult news that happens. So sometimes I find myself doing it almost by accident, but just planning a trip, planning something that I'm excited about, planning to do something different or unique. But I can say that the more times I do it, the quieter that voice gets. That voice that is, well, what if something bad happens? The more times that I just plan the fun thing, whatever it is, big or small, the less that voice has a say. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And also, seems like it's likely that those things will actually happen and you'll enjoy yourselves. And sure, there might be times when you plan something and something unexpected happens. And so I think this idea of sometimes of planning something but holding it lightly. In other words, recognize that many things in life can happen unexpectedly and that can disrupt plans. But I think better to plan, hold it lightly, knowing that it might have to change. But I think that's a healthier approach than saying I'm not going to plan anything, so I won't be disappointed. Again, it's just really about finding ways to live well with cancer, with the emphasis on live, right? And doing those, continuing to connect to things that are important and meaningful to you.
Yeah, no, I think that makes all the difference for sure. So let's talk a little bit. I know we've talked mostly about initial diagnosis, but let's just kind of address the idea that, okay, say you're doing these things, right? You're trying to focus on living in the present. You're doing the things that you feel, good about as far as taking good care of yourself. You're finding things to look forward to. Maybe you've implemented some of these strategies. And then you get thrown the curveball of there's something on your scans. What happens for us psychologically, what happens in our brain that causes us to, because I know from my experience, what happened for me is it was boom, boom, like I have nothing, I don't know what to do. Like it was like an instant of, and it didn't last forever, but like it was this moment of feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm floundering, I'm drowning, I'm helpless, and I have no control over anything. And it kind of took some reeling myself back in over time. And just to really, I mean, for me at least, I had to sit with the panic for a while, and that was a few days to a week sometimes. Each time I would get kind of a new influx of information. But what happens like in our brains that causes that,
Yeah,
response?
well, I think it's essentially that kind of fight or flight response. So when we're confronted with a threat or a challenge, something that feels like dangerous to us, and a diagnosis of cancer or cancer recurrence is certainly one of those things. We, our brains go into fight or what we call fight or flight mode, and there's actually three: there's fight, flight, or freeze. So sometimes right, we get angry and upset, or we get tearful and withdrawn, or sometimes we just feel paralyzed in the wake of this threat now, which is the cancer recurrence or metastases. And um, so I think initially it's about managing those emotions, and giving yourself a chance to do that. And we as humans don't like to, are not very good at sitting with difficult emotions, right? When we feel upset, when we feel down, particularly when we feel anxious and scared and fearful, it's our tendency to want to avoid those emotions, to distract.
Yeah, well, they're uncomfortable, like you said. Like they physically become uncomfortable in our bodies.
Absolutely. And it's not to say that distraction and sometimes, and we all do that, and we all need to do that sometimes. But there is value in naming those emotions. I'm feeling really scared right now, or gosh, I'm so sad, or to notice the emotions, to name them, and to sit with them for a bit, and then find ways to comfort yourself in that. So there's going to be a lot of emotions that come up around whether it's an initial diagnosis or recurrence or metastasis situation, and naming the emotions and is a way of coping. Um, and then I think the next important piece there is sharing that information with people who you're close to or you're comfortable sharing that with, in order to get the support of others, because that's, as humans, that's one of the main reasons that we cope is by that social support, and sometimes we need emotional support, sometimes we need logistical support, sometimes we just need someone to sit and just sit quietly next to us, but we need support in these difficult times, and so being willing to share what you're going through, and eliciting that support is also key, especially in those in the wake of a recurrence. So I think it's first tending to the emotional distress and upset of it, and then working with your medical team to talk about next steps, and then reestablishing some routines and taking care of yourself, and getting back to some semblance of a
Normalcy.
yeah.
Yeah, like whatever. I mean, it seems almost flippant to say that, but like it really is. Like there's that period of time when you're feeling it, and it's really big, and it's really scary, and it's heavy,
and that's normal,
and that's normal. And then you have some time to sit with that, and there's really like, and I think you've alluded to this, but there is no definitive timeline on what does that look like, and really we could argue that there might be waves of it, right? There might be waves of that anger and that frustration and that fight or flight, that fight, flight, or freeze kind of response, where you might have a couple of weeks of feeling really crappy and feeling all of the feelings really heavily, and then a month where you're just zeroed in, you're laser focused on what you can control, you're taking good care of yourself, you're working with your doctor, you have a plan, and then you get new information. Or maybe you don't even get new information. Maybe you're just told, okay, you're fine for now, and then you're forced to kind of sit back with everything that you just went through and accept it, like accept that it happened. And I think that can sometimes resurface those feelings of that, that anger. And really, I think it comes down to that grief of like grieving the life you had before, while at the same time, like trying your darn hardest, like to accept the life that you now live and what it looks like and what is involved with medical appointments and the community that you're a part of, and really any of the pieces of cancer that we could grow to resent. Like, we have to get to a place where we both hold space for the fact that it's difficult and we're mad about it, but that we also accept it. And it's just this, I don't know how to make it smash together, but somehow it's like Play-Doh of two different colors that gets mixed up and we make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, sorry, something you said a minute ago that triggered a thought, and I'm trying to pull it back. Pull it back now. I'm sorry, I lost that. So
That's okay. Maybe we'll come back to Play-Doh or something else. So, okay, we're dealing with these difficult emotions. I love that you talked about just making space for those difficult emotions, and then also, kind of recognizing that the tools that you may have implemented initially, like at initial diagnosis, those now come back into play, right? They cycle back, and it's kind of like the toolbox tools that we have in it can now be, the hammer was used on this piece of wood and now we're going to use it on this piece of wood. Like, we have the tools, we're using those tools in practice, and now we've had this reeling experience where something changed or something was scarier again, and we now have to put them back into practice again.
Yeah, so it's really this continual experience of adapting, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good word.
Something else comes along, and it's how do I adapt to this? And I did just think of what I was going to say a minute ago when you were talking about grief, and it is very much like a grief process, and as it comes in waves and comes and goes, and the thing about grief is that it's not something that we really ever get over. It's something that we tend to, and so. Sometimes I talk to people and they say, oh, I thought I had, gotten to this place of acceptance, or I had gotten past this, but here it is again. And maybe I didn't, I did something wrong, or I'm not trying hard enough, or and somehow it feels like a failure, when in fact, it's part of the process. Those ways grief comes and goes, and whether it's loss of the loved one, loss of our health, and so it's not about eliminating the waves, because we can't. It's about managing the waves and riding them out, if you will, as you go through this journey of ups and downs.
I love what you said there. It's not about making the waves go away. It's about riding them as they come. And I feel like I've talked about that before, like maybe, or written about it in my own personal kind of journal or social media posts and things. It's just that like it really does come in waves, that like sometimes I'm fine. Like, even dealing with a metastatic diagnosis, I never thought I would be able to like say that when I was first diagnosed, because initially like I was a wreck. But it really does come in waves, and sometimes it hits harder than others, and for different reasons, and for reasons that kind of come out of left field, like this is right, this is left, but like, they come out of left field, and sometimes they're things that are triggering to us, I think, as patients, that we didn't really anticipate could be triggering. Things like holidays, things like, different milestones with kids or grandkids, things that suddenly stick out differently in our brains. So can we just talk briefly about some of those kinds of milestones, and like kind of just getting to a point where we can just be aware that they're there, and that we're going to be confronted with those kind of triggers. What are maybe, like, can you think of maybe a specific coping strategy that you suggest to patients for dealing with those triggers when they arise? because they're not bad things, but they do cause that feeling of like all of the grief and all of the uncertainty, all of those things kind of well back up.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the first thing to note is that right, that at those milestone events, that those the feelings of grief or sadness or worry or fear are normal and natural. And I think when you're aware of that and can anticipate that, then it makes it perhaps a bit easier to cope with, and it doesn't take one by such surprise when it happens. And again, I think making space to acknowledge or feel those emotions when they come up is part of the coping as well.
So can I just ask a question? When you say making space for emotions, what would be some tools, some strategies, some kind of ways that like tangible ways that like somebody can make space for emotions? We talked about naming them. So like we could verbally come out and say, I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling grief. But what are some other kind of tools that people could use? I guess I'm just thinking like, I don't know. And I know like one that comes to mind for me at least is holding space for my feelings. Like if I don't have time, because I'm a mom of 3, I have a job, I have like lots of things going on. Sometimes I don't have time to just wallow in everything all the time. But if I don't allow space for it at all and I push it down, then it comes out in other ways. I get angry, I get irritable, those kinds of things. Kind of there's this balance. But one of the things that I have taken to doing is just trying to allow 3 to 5 minutes a day when I'm in a really heavy emotional place that I will just sit with and feel and cry and think about all the what ifs and all the negative things. And I'll put a timer on my watch and I'll set a timer for 5 minutes. And then when the timer's done, then I'm like, okay. And then I center myself and I move on and I like just let it go. But that's just one strategy, I guess. So can you maybe name another two?
That's a really good strategy, and you're right. The waves aren't going of motion or aren't going to come always at convenient times when you have the time and the space just to stop and sit with it, and that's okay. But when you do have time, and sometimes it's about making time. Whether it's 3 to 5 minutes like you do, Danae, or whether it's setting aside other times in your day or on a weekend or maybe in the evening when things are quieter to kind of reflect on emotions. And the process you were just talking about is very similar to an approach that I talk to folks about. And there's an acronym that's used in this kind of context. It's RAIN, RAIN. And so R is for recognizing, first of all, your emotions. So and A is kind of accepting and allowing those emotions to be there. I is for inspecting and investigating. So kind of this sense of this idea of I'm feeling really sad. What's this about? What's bringing this on? Is there something else underlying this? Because when we understand where our emotions are coming from, it's making us sad or angry or worried. Then it can we can have more flexibility or more ability to figure out what it is that we need in order to address that.
Well, and I think I've heard it said too, and I think I've heard this acronym before. So before we get to N, while we're talking about inspecting and investigating, like sometimes just the sheer act of asking your brain the question, why am I feeling this way? Like it's enough to kind of help get your brain back on board so that it's no longer stuck in this kind of animalistic fight or flight space. And it's now in the logical processing place, which is it's a lot easier to navigate our emotions, I think, from that place than it is from I guess what sometimes is alluded to as like the monkey brain, so to speak, when like everything just feels everywhere. But that asking the questions, I feel like that makes a huge difference in our ability to process.
It's also the way that we understand what's going on with us. So I think oftentimes, especially with difficult emotions like anger, sadness, fear, worry, we see them as bad or negative emotions. When really all emotions are just our body's way of telling us that something important is going on, and so when we see our emotions as messages, as things to figure out what is the message that my body is telling me right now, what is this emotion about, then we learn more about ourselves and what it is that we need. So I try and kind of try and help people make a shift away from there's good emotions and bad emotions to, oh, these are emotions, these are messages. What is this message here right now trying to tell me? And so so that investigating what is this emotion about, what's going on right now, you're right, is a way of, I use the words kind of connecting our emotional brains with our thinking brains, and you're right, it does kind of shift the emotional tone then of what you're experiencing. And then the N refers to kind of nurturing, or this idea of I'm feeling this difficult emotion or this emotion right now. What is it that I need? What is it that I need right now to take care of myself? And maybe that's, I need to go do something to take my mind off. It might mean I need to, ask my partner for a hug. It may mean I need to go do something that is soothing to myself, whether that's listening to something that's soothing, feeling doing an activity that nurtures or soothes ourselves.
No, I love that.
So I think that's a useful, again, acronyms are helpful in that it reminds us of some tools and strategies that we can use to help ourselves through those emotional waves and difficult times.
No, I think that's so important. And just kind of like as a addition to that is that some people may be more comfortable talking about this. They may be the kind of person who needs to talk through it, and they need to vocalize as they're going through this RAIN process, right? They may need to physically be speaking to someone. So sometimes I think that's where a therapist comes in handy. That's where having those trusted friends and family in your circle, those, fellow patients maybe who you can lean on for support. But also, like, there's going to be some people who they don't process as well verbally, and maybe they need to write, maybe they need to draw, maybe, there's so many different ways that I think that we can let out emotion. Some people I know, they exercise, they run, and they run harder and faster when they're mad and sad than they do when they're, just neutral. So just recognizing that, like, there's no set way, like no perfect way to like process your emotions. Like, just figure out what do you need, and be willing to question it and sit with it and try it. And if it doesn't feel right, and if it doesn't feel like it's helpful, then like that's when you adjust. That's when you try something different. That's when you try a support group for the Zoom groups that we have on Tuesday nights for the Ocular site. Maybe you try meeting in person with somebody who also is going through cancer of any kind, or this cancer specifically. Like, and just I feel like kind of the overarching message that I hope that we can convey from this is that it's figure outable, right? That we can get through it. We can ask questions, we can adjust, we can try new things. Does it always solve the end game? Does it provide a cure and make it so that we never have to deal with this ever again? Not really, but it at least makes it manageable. And I think that if we can approach this kind of idea of protecting our mental health and just navigating this diagnosis, if we can approach it from that perspective, that it is figure outable, even if it's just a tiny piece at a time, then it just takes away so much of the power that the fear can have on us, I think. And it just gives us back that kind of sense of ownership and control, which, we talked about at the beginning, is so important.
Yeah, and I think along with that is comes hope, right? When things are when we have the capacity to to use tools to manage the ups and downs, to deal with difficult things. I think it creates some hope, and hope throughout the cancer journey shifts as well, right? Maybe, sometimes there's hope for cure, sometimes there's hope for long remission, sometimes there's hope for good quality of life. But I think there's always hope, and there's always ways of managing difficult things, and finding, and you're right, finding what works for you is the key. And I think a lot of people who go through cancer find that other people have lots of advice to give to them. You should do this. You shouldn't do this. Try this. But ultimately, you're the best. You as an individual are the best person to know what's helpful for you, what works for you, and to kind of trust in your own wisdom that you'll find a path through this.
No, I think that's so important, and I apologize. I'm scrolling my phone trying to find something that I shared it in stories for our patients at some point, and now I can no longer find it, so I'm a little bummed I can't find it. But there was a patient that I saw, and I just kind of want to address this little tidbit here, and it's just this idea that sometimes when we're trying to be positive, and we're trying to think positively and be hopeful, right, about what can happen. Sometimes, like, because our brains are so hardwired to this place of negativity, sometimes it can almost feel like not impossible, but just like it almost feels disingenuous, or it feels somehow like dissonant to say something like, say before a scan, you want to say the affirmation, or you want to say to yourself, okay, like, everything's going to be okay. And it's like, you want to believe that, but there's a huge part of the rest of you that fights against that, right? This dissonance that can happen. And what this one gal in our community, she had shared was she was going into scans, and she had been trying to tell herself, like, okay, what if everything's okay? And instead of that being what ended up kind of being reasonable to her brain and acceptable to her brain, she ended up kind of tweaking it just a little bit, so that it was, instead of everything's going to be okay, it might be okay. Like, that was for her brain, that was more believable. That was more hopeful feeling than kind of that sense of doomsday what if that came when she would try to think about what if everything is okay. And so, like, I think just recognizing that our brains, those little nuances in the language that we use to describe our experience, can really make a big difference in how we process and how we show up to things like scans and doctor's appointments, things that can be anxiety-ridden experiences. That if we can just kind of tweak the language around them and just play around with it, play with different words, because our brains are really good at answering questions, and they're really good at listening to whatever words we feed it. And so I feel like if we can just kind of tweak those, then that can help for sure.
Yes, I agree. And because our brains aren't always going to buy into those positives. Everything's going to be all right. I'm going to be just fine. Nothing bad's going to happen. If those things seem a bit unreasonable, overly optimistic, our brains aren't going to buy into them, and so that's going to be perhaps particularly helpful to us. But so it's maybe not. So it's finding kind of a more balanced way of thinking of things, like, this might be okay, or this is going to be hard, but I have ways of managing this.
Yeah, or like, this is hard right now, but I've done hard things before. And I think those kinds of, like, kind of those little reminders can kind of take again, back to that fight, flight, or freeze response. It just helps take us out of that fight, flight, or freeze response and into a place where, we're not necessarily perfectly calm, but, like, we're at least in a place that we can put one foot in front of the other and figure out, okay, what's my next step?
Yeah. And that's success a lot of times. Right.
Yes. Well, do we have just maybe 5 or 10 minutes that we can talk briefly about boundaries? Okay, because I feel like this is something that can be challenging as a patient. Sometimes and I think sometimes the hardest part about it is not knowing what your boundaries are yet, because you're in the middle of figuring them out yourself. But just like in talking to loved ones, like we mentioned, talking to friends, talking to family, and just sharing about your experience. Well, what happens when it's kind of flipped the other way, right? What if the person is coming to you and asking you all of these things and talking to you about here's my ideas and here's what you should do and here's my 2 cents and have you tried this? How do you help patients kind of come to a place where they can recognize, okay, I've hit my limit. I need a break from talking about cancer. And what are maybe some simple phrases that you might, encourage someone to use if they need a break from talking about it, or they just, want to do their own thing and not be given medical advice from friends?
This comes up so often with people I talk to, and and I think one of the boundaries is you're not obligated to share any information you don't want to share. Talk about your cancer when you don't want to, this is and that's not being kind of rude or selfish. That's just recognizing kind of what you need and being and taking responsibility for that. I think one strategy that can help is to have some phrases that you've prepared ahead of time for situations, so that when you encounter them, you're kind of ready with a response. So for example, you're maybe at the grocery store and someone comes up to you and, oh, how are you? And starts asking, questions about cancer, and you have a ready response, something like, oh, thanks for asking. I'm doing okay, but right now I'm here to get my shopping done and figure out dinner for tonight. So kind of acknowledging their interest, but turning the conversation in a way that signals, this is not what I'm here for. This is not what I'm focusing on right now. Or someone starts giving medical advice, again, having a phrase that you've already prepared, something perhaps like, I appreciate your interest. I've got a great medical team and they're giving me great advice. So something, again, a phrase that you feel comfortable saying that sends the message that thank you, but I've got it, and kind of shuts down that conversation if it's conversation that you're not wanting to have.
Yeah, no, I think those are some really good, just simple, easy like phrases to use. And we did have one come in through the comments from our live listeners, and one of them was, she said, my favorite phrase is, I don't have cancer right now, which is totally applicable for many in our community, because the cancer's treated in your eye and hopefully it never metastasizes. So you could go 5, 10, 15 years before you have any cancer show up again. And that's complicated to try to explain to someone. So sometimes it's just easier to be like, I don't have cancer right now. Like, this is true in the moment. I don't have cancer right now. Like, so, and that also, again, draws that line gently, like, and in an effective way to tell, just to tell them, like, hey, I'm not having this conversation right now because it's not actually relevant to me. But I think just having, like you said, those prepared responses and just recognizing the times that it does come up and that it causes maybe some dissonance or some frustration in a relationship, and then to, investigate, go back to RAIN, like go back to those investigational feelings of like, okay, why am I feeling so frustrated at this person for talking to me in this way? And then, I think that that's part of what setting boundaries is. It's not knowing ahead of time what you're going to do. It's knowing that if it does happen and you're uncomfortable with it, that you can prevent it happening again in the future. That's what setting the boundary is. So I just wanted to make sure that we briefly address that. We are running a lot, like just more than I was planning for. So I apologize for taking so much of your time, but I appreciate all of the conversation that we've had.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on and being willing to put this kind of information out there, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's so important, so vital. Do you have maybe like a book or two, a podcast, just like really just focused on mental health, trauma, like any of those kinds of things that you would suggest that somebody might go and check out and look up as an option? Because I know not everyone has the opportunity to meet with a therapist or a psychologist. So books are some of the ways that I think we can get help for
Yeah,
ourselves.
absolutely. Along those lines, a shout out to Ann Osborne, who has, many of you may know, has published a book on ocular melanoma. Oh, there you go. I had the pleasure of meeting Ann in Nashville at the conference, and I have a copy of her book, and so I think that's a useful resource to address both the kind of medical and some of the mental health aspects of dealing with OM. A couple other books that I often recommend to folks as ways more in terms of coping in general with trauma or difficult life events. One's called When Life Hits Hard, and that's by an author named Russ Harris, who's actually a psychiatrist, but he focuses on some strategies to use when really difficult things happen in life. These skills and strategies he talks about are based on an approach to therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. But he writes in a really conversational way, makes information, I think, really digestible and approachable, and has some useful tools. The other book I like is When Things Fall Apart, by Pema Chodron. She comes from a more Buddhist background, but has a lot of, I think, really helpful things to say about dealing with stress and crisis and trauma and loss. So those two books aren't specific to cancer, but I think from a mental health perspective, have a lot to offer in terms of kind of normalizing what we experience, the emotions that we experience when we go through crises, and ways of responding that can be helpful.
Oh, I think those are some really good ones. I know I've heard of the Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart. I'm not sure if you know who Brene Brown is, but Brene Brown references Pema Chodron like a ton in her podcast and her books. Another book that came up to mind when you mentioned the When Life Gets Hard is it's called On Fire by John O'Leary. And he talks about his experience as a burn victim and living with literal head to toe burns on his whole body that he survived miraculously. But it's the kind of survival that sometimes I'm sure you wish that you had not, because it's so painful physically and mentally and emotionally in so many ways. So just wanted to make sure that we offered a couple of resources for people out there. Well, I feel like this has been such a good conversation, and I hope that everybody who's listening in the recording is able to find some value from this. If someone is in obviously a different area than where you are, do you feel like there's pretty much across the board that most oncologists are going to have at least a connection to someone like you that they could at least try to link their patients up with, or is it kind of unique to each location?
I think each oncology program is a bit different, but I think probably all oncology clinics, of course, are aware of the mental health impact of cancer, and that could be a good place to start in terms of, tell me what mental health resources are in my community to help me cope. The other thing, as hard as COVID was, I think one of the things that has come out of it is greater accessibility to mental health services through telehealth. So it may be that there's not a therapist in your community that's easily accessible, but there are now programs that offer telehealth counseling, and so that can be an option as well.
No, I think that's such a good point. Just to look for those possibilities and recognize that they are there, kind of in thanks to some of the difficult things that we've dealt with as a society in the last few years. Well, I appreciate you and just our live audience. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for listening and for your comments and interaction. Thank you guys again for joining us. And Dr. Sanger, I'm going to go ahead and let you get back to the rest of your day.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the I Believe podcast, brought to you by Castle Biosciences Please be sure to subscribe, and if you're so inclined, send this episode over to friends, family, and share on your social media to help spread awareness around OM. If you have a moment, leave us a brief review or consider making a donation to the links in the show notes to keep our podcast going. Feel free to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at A Cure in Sight. We'll see you next time on the I Believe podcast.